Luna never expected her life to change so drastically. One moment, it was just her and her mom, a small but comfortable life built on quiet routines and an unspoken understanding. Then, almost overnight, everything shifted. Her mother's whirlwind romance with Zane's father had seemed like something distant. Something that didn't truly affect her. But now, standing in a new house, staring at the unfamiliar walls, she realized there was no escaping this reality. Zane wasn't just some stranger. He was her stepbrother now. The thought made her stomach twist. They barely knew each other. And yet they were expected to coexist under the same roof. To act like a family when they were anything but. She could feel the weight of her mother's hopeful gaze. The expectation that she and Zane would somehow fall into an effortless sibling dynamic. But Luna knew better. The first dinner together was unbearable, forced conversation, clinking silverware, and tension so thick it was suffocating. Zane barely spoke, his eyes fixed on his plate, while Luna forced down every bite. She already felt like an outsider in her own life, trapped in a new reality she had no say in. And worse, she had no idea how to escape it. The silence between Luna and Zane stretched like an invisible barrier, thick and impenetrable. They had been living under the same roof for weeks now, yet every interaction was stiff, carefully measured. At first, they had avoided each other as much as possible, Luna retreating to her room, Zane disappearing into his own world. But avoidance could only last so long. One evening, as a storm raged outside, Luna found herself curled up on the couch, flipping mindlessly through TV channels. The dim glow of the screen cast flickering shadows across the room, the rain tapping insistently against the windows. She hadn't expected company, but then Zane appeared, standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You always watch random shows you don't care about?" he asked. His voice smooth but edged with something she couldn't quite place. Luna huffed, shifting to the side as if to silently invite him to sit. "And you always lurk in doorways?" To her surprise, a small smirk tugged at his lips as he sank onto the opposite end of the couch. The silence between them wasn't entirely comfortable, but for the first time, it didn't feel unbearable. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be so impossible after all. The awkward tension between Luna and Zane had started to shift, subtly, like the first signs of dawn creeping into the night. It wasn't something either of them acknowledged out loud, but it was there, in the way their interactions became less forced. Conversations that were once clipped and obligatory now stretched a little longer, curiosity slipping into their words. One afternoon, Luna found herself in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of tea when she heard Zane's voice behind her. "You drink that stuff like it's a life source," he mused, leaning against the counter. She glanced over her shoulder, raising a brow. "And you sulk in doorways like it's an Olympic sport." A chuckle, soft, unexpected, escaped him. Luna tried not to let it affect her, but something about the sound made her stomach flip. He stepped closer, reaching past her to grab a glass from the cupboard. For a brief moment, his arm brushed against hers. The simple touch sent an unexpected warmth through her, catching her off guard. Neither of them said anything about it, but as Zane filled his glass with water, Luna couldn't shake the feeling that their careful distance was beginning to crumble. One evening, Luna found herself sitting on the back porch, wrapped in a sweater, staring at the sky as the cool night air settled around her. The house was quiet, their parents long asleep, but she couldn't bring herself to go inside just yet. The silence felt too heavy, too full of unspoken things. She heard the door creak open behind her, then soft footsteps. "Zane. You always sit out here this late?" he asked, his voice lower in the darkness. She exhaled a quiet laugh. "Sometimes, it's peaceful." He didn't respond right away, just moved beside her and sat down, his knee barely grazing hers. A moment passed, and then another, the air between them thick with something neither of them wanted to name. "I get it," he finally said, tilting his head toward the sky. "It's easier to think when everything's quiet." Luna turned to look at him, finding his gaze already on her. For a second, neither of them moved. the tension curling around them like the cool breeze. It was a fragile moment. Delicate and dangerous. She should have looked away. She didn't, and neither did he. Luna knew she was playing with fire. Every stolen glance, every moment alone with Zayn felt like tiptoeing on the edge of something she wasn't ready to name. But she couldn't stop. One evening, they were in the kitchen. The dim glow of the overhead light casting long shadows as she rummaged through the fridge. "Want anything?" she asked casually, not expecting much of a response. But Zayn stepped closer, just enough that she could feel his presence behind her. "No," he murmured. She turned, only to find him already watching her. The space between them felt charged, the air thick with something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. "This is," she started, but the words tangled in her throat. "Complicated," Zayn finished, his voice barely above a whisper. Luna swallowed hard. She should step back, put space between them, remind herself that they were supposed to be family now. But she didn't move, neither did he. His gaze flickered down to her lips. Just for a second, but it was enough to send a shiver through her. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just tension, it was something dangerous. And she didn't know how to stop it. The tension between Luna and Zayn had become unbearable. Every conversation was layered with something unspoken. Every glance a silent dare. But that night, as the house settled into quiet, everything finally reached its breaking point. Luna was curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone. When Zayn walked in, he hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to leave. But then he sat down beside her, closer than usual. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low. She exhaled, her grip tightening around her phone. "I don't know what you're talking about." Zayn chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. "Luna, we both know that's not true." Her heart pounded as he turned slightly, his knee brushing against hers. She should have moved away, created space, but she stayed frozen in place. "This shouldn't be happening," she whispered. "Then tell me to leave," Zayn challenged, his gaze locking onto hers. Luna opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She didn't want him to go. And he knew it. The weight of the moment pressed down on them. Heavy, electric, and just like that, they both knew, there was no turning back. The air between Luna and Zayn crackled with an intensity neither of them could ignore. That night, the weight of their unspoken feelings grew unbearable, pressing down on them like a storm waiting to break. Luna had retreated to her bedroom, seeking refuge in the quiet. But it didn't last long. A soft knock echoed against her door before it creaked open, revealing Zayn. He stood there, hesitating just long enough for her to realize that this was different. "We need to talk," he murmured, stepping inside before she could tell him no. Luna swallowed hard, hugging her knees to her chest as she sat on the edge of her bed. "There's nothing to talk about," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. Zayn closed the door behind him, leaning against it like he was trying to keep the outside world from seeping in. "You don't mean that," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less certain. She forced a shaky breath, her fingers digging into the fabric of her hoodie. "This is wrong." Zayn took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "Then why does it feel so impossible to stop?" Silence, heavy, unforgiving, and in that moment, they both knew, the line had already been crossed. The tension between Luna and Zayn was a living thing, an unspoken truth neither of them dared acknowledge yet couldn't seem to escape. Every glance, every accidental touch carried a weight that pressed down on them, thickening the air with something they refused to name. One evening, when the rest of the house had settled into the comfort of sleep, Luna found herself in the dimly lit kitchen, mindlessly tracing the rim of her glass. She had hoped the silence would clear her head, but instead, it only made her more aware of how restless she felt. Then, footsteps. She didn't have to turn to know it was Zayn. She could feel him before he even spoke. "Can't sleep?" His voice was rough, quieter than usual. Luna shook her head, staring into her untouched drink. "You?" He exhaled, leaning against the counter beside her. Not really. The pause stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Luna finally turned to face him, her pulse quickening at the way his eyes locked onto hers. Zane? She meant to push him away, to remind him of the boundary they had already blurred. But when he took a step closer, neither of them moved to stop it. Luna knew she should walk away. She should push Zane out of her mind, pretend the lingering glances and stolen moments never happened. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more it consumed her. Days passed in a haze of forced normalcy, yet every time their eyes met across the dinner table, every time their hands brushed in passing, the unspoken tension coiled tighter, pulling them into a dangerous gravity. She felt it in the way Zane's gaze lingered too long, in the way his voice softened when he said her name. One night, the weight of it all became unbearable. She was curled up in bed, staring at the ceiling, when she heard the faintest knock at her door. Her heart lurched. She knew who it was before she even answered. Zane stood in the dim hallway, his expression torn between hesitation and something far deeper. "I shouldn't be here," he murmured, but he didn't step back. Luna swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the doorframe. "Then why are you?" she whispered. He didn't answer, not with words. Instead, his hand reached for hers, and in that moment, she realized they had already crossed the line. Luna stood at the edge of the ocean, the salty breeze tangling in her hair as the waves crashed against the shore. She had come here to clear her head, to escape the suffocating weight of what had happened between her and Zane. But no matter how far she ran, the truth clung to her like the tide, inevitable, relentless. She closed her eyes, feeling the cool water lap at her toes, wishing it could wash away the guilt that had settled deep in her chest. What had they done? What had they become? The lines they had crossed weren't just about desire, they had rewritten the very foundation of their family. Tangled themselves in something that could never be undone. Footsteps crunched against the sand behind her. She didn't have to turn to know it was him. "You left without saying anything." Zane's voice was quiet, careful. Luna let out a breath, steadying herself before turning to face him. "I didn't know what to say." His eyes searched hers, filled with the same conflict she felt. "Tell me you regret it," he said. Luna hesitated, her heart pounding. "I don't know if I can." Life is full of complicated emotions, and sometimes we find ourselves in situations we never expected. The key is to recognize when feelings are leading us down a path that could bring more harm than good. Boundaries matter, not just for ourselves but for those around us. It's important to take a step back, reflect, and ask ourselves if the choices we're making align with the values we hold. Emotional clarity comes from honest conversations, with ourselves and with others. In moments of confusion, seek guidance, lean on trusted friends, and remember that some lines, once crossed, can never be undone.